Hello, my name is Ildiko,
And I'm Phil.
and this is the My Open Source Experience podcast.
Open source is freedom.
Open source is great collaboration.
Open source is good engineering.
Open source is not a business model.
Open source is community.
Open source is interesting.
Open source is the future.
Open source is your opportunity to change the world around you.
Yeah, let's start recording. This sounds like fun.
Hello, Phil.
Hey, Ildiko. How you doing?
Good. I am very, very excited. How about you?
I'm super excited to get season 2 started.
I know. I mean, Northern Hemisphere, it's fall coming. So hopefully that will inspire people who are here to cozy up with a nice cup of tea or favorite beverage and listen to a lot of great episode and content that we have coming. Before touching a little bit on that, let's look into what happened since we closed out season 1, which was in June 2024.
Well, we know that the AI definition has continued to roll along, and it seems to be getting closer and closer to being released. And so that's causing lots of conversation, some of it somewhat controversial, as the various sides try to figure out what's the best way to define open source AI.
I definitely did see the AI conversations as well. I'm trying to get better at staring at social media a little bit less. There are definitely a lot of conversations that I see, even there, happening about the effort that the Open Source Initiative, or in short, the OSI, is doing in terms of organizing town halls and getting people's thoughts and opinions about what open source AI is and should be, and how to define that. So to me, while I was not there when the open source term was invented, and people started to use it, but it kind of feels like that this is another era where we are creating a very crucial definition. So personally, I hope that we will come up with something that is a bit more demanding and restrictive at first, and then refine it from there.
Some people are very happy with the direction of the cooking of the definition, and some people aren't. And it's not an easy question to answer, because I mean, it has huge implications, right? If you don't have the ability from scratch to recreate that model, then you don't know what's been put in it. And that's the biggest concern, is the ability for a malevolent entity to hard code, pseudo hard code. It's obfuscated because of the way it's been done, but hard coding things that really aren't good. And it could be done on accident with bias. It could be done on purpose with bad intentions, and without the data to actually regen it. This is compiling from source, right? I mean, you don't know exactly what's inside the thing unless you can look at the code, know exactly what it's doing, compile it, and run it. So anytime we take something in a binary form, it's very similar to just taking a model. If you don't have the ability to actually, start with empty weights and parameters, and then have this thing build with that same set of training data. So
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about this, well, we will talk about this. And the interesting part of the AI challenge is that even if you have every single bit and component, and probably even if you have access to the same hardware that the model was originally trained on, you may most likely not get the same output the second time if you do the training.
Not exactly.
So, what, and I think that's where a lot of the controversy is coming from, in a sense, because the output is non-deterministic, and like how we are dealing with that, and what you're losing if you don't have the exact data set, and like how big of a challenge that is. Who actually does have the infrastructure to train a proper model on, because it is not cheap. It doesn't come
No.
cheap.
There are much smaller models that actually you can run, maybe not on your laptop, but on a laptop, that are getting better all the time as well. But for the large models and the things that like Llama 3, the whatever 800 billion parameter Llama 3, yeah, that's a serious piece of hardware to get anywhere close. And so what would we want? What kind of declaration of transparency as to how the thing was built would make people comfortable? It's not as though you can recreate, but like I said, there are more reasons why you can't recreate than just not having all of that material. So it
Yeah.
like I said, I think it's going to end up having to be a compromise.
Obviously, there is some more steps left in the road. So the open source AI definition is not there yet. So it is not ready and it's not announced. So I'm very curious to see where it will land. And then I'm sure we will have some content afterwards, once we have a first version on this podcast as well. I find it very interesting, that somehow being able to use the open source label is very important to everyone. Like, look at all those models that are called open source. Like, I think Llama was called or labeled open source numerous times by Meta in everywhere. And for some reason, it is so important to someone, I assume either very low or very high up the marketing and sales chain, to say that we must label this with open source for some reason, to look good, to feel good, to make this look more friendly or something.
And I think for AI, I think what has been done to date with companies like Meta, like Stability AI, I think it's extremely valuable, because it's very easy for this technology to go the way of a cloud provider or a software as a service provider, where you've got an API, it's my proprietary API. I will deliver all of this tremendous value to you based off this extremely large language model or some version of a generative AI, whatever. And that becomes the norm, right? The API economy becomes the norm there instead of something else. Whereas the something else that exists today is the thing that companies are calling AI, or that they're calling open source, right? Meta is an organization that finds doing artificial intelligence to be extremely important. It's extremely important to the evolution of their products and for all of their customers, but it is not the be all end all revenue stream that they plan on making. Whereas for OpenAI, that's exactly what that is, right? Stability AI, also a very AI focused organization. They wanted to put their models out open source. They'll deliver with support and services and customizations. It's a different model, but it's one that allows for a lot more organizations to have the benefit of and to continue to modify, tweak, and customize a model to their desired needs. So and that's huge. But I mean, we could live in a world where there just isn't any open source AI in any form, way, shape, or form, right? There aren't any models that you can get your hands on, that you can tweak, that you can look at the code, maybe not the data, maybe not how the weights got there, but you can look at the weights. You can look at how many parameters they are and how they're connected to one another, right? That's the level of openness, right, that Meta has gone to, plus the fact that, I'm sorry, but if you're larger than a certain size that you might want to compete with us, you can't use it either. That's clearly not an open source thing. But it does allow for a lot of other folks to if nothing else, it allows for everybody to analyze it. It allows some to use it, and where that some is the vast majority of the rest of the planet. There's only a few that fit that criteria where they can't. But it takes us farther down the road, right, of openness, just not to the level of, as you said, the set of restrictions that would require it to really be open source, right? That you could really have the four freedoms and you could really be able to, again, know exactly what that was. And as we've talked about before, one of stability and security. But like I said, it's interesting. We'll see where the companies go with this. But I get your point. That it's this word open source seems to mean something, and certainly in lots of other contexts in open source, we've seen companies who didn't really want to do open source call their stuff open source. But at least for me in AI and what has happened thus far, I can understand parts of it. And like I said, I think parts of it it's better than the alternative, but it's not exactly what we're used to from the four freedoms.
Yeah, it's just I think what's fascinating to me is that they could say source available, or they could say any other word and term that actually describes what is in the license, but they are adamant in trying to say that it is an open source license, which it is absolutely not. There is a new field that is trending upwards, and somehow it cannot trend upwards without the push from using the label open source. And on the other hand, we will actually have quite a few conversations about licenses in season 2 as well. Because that is still a pretty hot topic in terms of the bait and switch and the source available and what's going to happen to AI. Why is it good or absolutely not good to have copyright on software? We have an episode coming up dissecting that dilemma a little bit as well. Not that we can do anything about it at this point, but I think it is a very interesting viewpoint and perspective that I didn't have before we had that conversation. And it just put it into perspective to me a little bit. And it makes it easier for me to understand why we are in such a pickle on on some of the things. Sometimes I think about like the whole state of the ecosystem and open source, because there seem to be some conversations about the like the sustainability of open source. I saw and heard conversations about more and more conversations about funding, for example, in the ecosystem. Like I attended FOSSI this year in Portland again in 2024, and there were a few sessions and talks about open source funding. Where is it coming from? Where is it not coming from? And why not? And what the implications are and might be, and how the amount of current funding that we seem to have, like the numbers look bigger. But if you think about how massively large the open source ecosystem is, and how many people are investing their time and resources into open source projects, that money is not really enough for much. And there are still I think there were one or two talks at that conference, for example, that looked into like little libraries and software projects that are open source, and are in higher demand, but with a really small base, really small group of people who are maintaining those. So like the quality and the risks associated, because there aren't enough people who are able to maintain the library, and there are a lot of tools and companies and solutions that are depending on it at the same time. So that was really interesting, and then talks and conversations sort of building on it in terms of like how to show the value of open source, like when you're working for a company, what is your business strategy, why should you decide to invest in open source projects, and to someone like me, who's been in the ecosystem for over 10 years now, like how can someone choose not to, is the question. So there have been a lot of conversations that I think are timely, and some of them are, I don't know, a little scary or concerning, but I'm happy that we are having them, because then we can look into how to make this collaborative software development methodology that we also do under the name of open source, something that is sustainable long term. What do you think about these?
Oh, I think it's a great topic. I mean, you just made a lot of statements there to unpack, and I mean, I guess first off, I would say I don't think there's been a method for those that are responsible for open source projects to clearly articulate what their expectations are and what their willingness is to support what level of usage um, that users might possibly want to do with their project. Right. This is the fundamental question of, if somebody creates something and they're a hobbyist and other people seem to be liking their code and they're taking it and using it, hey, that's great. But it's if the expectation that it was never going to be production capable for a commercial product with all of the security measures that would need to go around that, is that really the obligation of that project? Is that really a project that's suitable for commercial use? And whose fault is it that it's in a commercial product? As far as who's going to take care of that from a sustainability standpoint, I think we start with those kind of questions. And then something that I've been spending a reasonable amount of time thinking through is it's really also a balance, right? I mean, let's take OpenStack, for example. It had a tremendous plethora of contributors, but it had a serious dearth of maintainers and committers who would actually be able to look at blueprints, look at code contributions, and be able to bring them in. And so there was a huge bottleneck. What's the right balance? Was that a problem of funding, so to speak, in that the companies that were participating weren't willing to let their developers become committers? Or was it an attempt by the project to do quality control, and that quality control mandated putting significant gates on a very large number of contributors, trying to get a very diverse set of things into that code base? Right. And so software development, particularly large projects, it's often the case that it's a balance of where the different community members are putting their efforts, and who's doing non-functional requirements. Are there enough people to do non-functional requirements? Because that does seem to normally be the problem when those are very popular projects. So yeah, and you come back to funding. Every project that I engage with, Linux being the best funded and oldest and most mature and well established and got their processes all down. And, every time I go to an open source summit event, Jonathan Corbett gives a presentation on Linux, and his number one item is maintainer burnout. It's like, if Linux is doing maintainer burnout and they're the best we've got, we have a serious problem with stability in our supply chain. So it's like I said, it's a problem that's just getting worse. You can fund with money, you can fund with in-kind developers. From me representing the companies that I've worked for, I always try to go with the in-kind developers because I think there's a tremendous value in doing so to the company. But it is that balance. I mean, I remember when, first we were trying to convince companies to use open source, and then we were trying to convince them to submit bugs. Then we were convincing them to submit features. And now we're saying, well, there's so many features, we need more people to do the committer role of reviewing all of those features. Right. And those are all different areas of the same need for an entire system of software development in that collaborative manner. And we have a lot of open source out there where some of it just isn't meant to be commercial, right? And so how do we delineate that and let those poor maintainers be, as opposed to continuing to giving them new requirements? So I think there's a lot of maturity actually that still needs to happen in the open source ecosystem, and it may very well mean that in some sense there's less open source available for commercial use. And I don't think that's a bad thing either. I think having the knowledge of what is intended and what an ecosystem around some set of software has for being commercial grade, right? And having that support structure as a software the supply chain element, I think that's important. And I think that's where we need to get to as an industry.
Yeah, I think that like as you talk about things like, the rapid growth of a project and then how to sustain that on the long run. And you mentioned OpenStack as an example, but now we can also start to study the Kubernetes ecosystem, which is another large project. And you can see somewhat different approaches in terms of how to handle that growth, but also some of the very similar and same challenges. Like if you look into core Kubernetes, there are the same challenges there in terms of maintainers and burnout, and it's
Everywhere.
it's not the sexy part of the code, as we often say. Like it's not where the new attention is. Everyone just expects core Kubernetes to work, to be stable, to be as bug free as possible. I think that talking about things like the burnout, the maintainer burnout challenge. I think you also mentioned the Linux kernel at one point, that maintainer burnout is a thing there too. It's not going to be there forever unless there are people, companies who are putting time, effort, and investment into it. It's not something that just grows on trees. When it comes to things like the Cyber Resiliency Act in Europe, and I think the other part is called product liability
Directive.
directive. Yes, I think that we really need to think about all these things as an ecosystem. And if you are, in fact, grabbing something that was openly and publicly available and decided to commercialize it, then we do need to talk about levels of responsibility. But saying that the person who originally came up with the idea and said that this is not something that I'm going to be profiting from, and making it available for anyone to do whatever they want with it, like pointing back to that person, is definitely not going to go far other than ruining individuals' lives.
But we have we have that situation, right? I mean, I was just talking to a group who the purpose of their collaboration was to create a proof of concept. So security was not it's not a factor. That's not why they did the work. But the code is out there as open source. And these were companies that did this. And so and ultimately that proof of concept, that at least the ideas behind the proof of concept will probably end up in a product or two. Right. So are those companies now liable for that collaborative work they did just as a proof of concept with several different academic institutions in this particular case? Who's on the hook for this code? Is anybody supposed to be on the hook for that code? And the CRA actually says yes. It is. These are some of the cases that really scare organizations because, you know, for me, when I learned about open source, it was always really up to the user, right? This code is free to use and you can do anything you want to with it, including support it yourself and make it do what you want to. But the obligations of where you got it from, that's why they all say as is. All the licenses say as is. It's the guy who wrote the code or entity that wrote the code doesn't claim any responsibility for fit for purpose or anything else. So yeah, it's an interesting time that we live in. These will be interesting discussions that we can continue to have with our guests because again, the CRA is coming, and so people are really trying to start to react and figure out what that's going to mean for them delivering commercial software that's, from a line of code standpoint is 80% plus open source.
I think that if we need something like the CRA and other efforts in other parts of the globe to shed a light on, you actually need to look into what you're shipping. I mean, it's I don't think that it is a bad thing that um, governments are looking into this, and there is some kind of regulation that is coming that is supposed to incentivize the commercial entities that there is some responsibility in what is being shipped and someone has to take responsibility. I'm just hoping that it will not go down towards the least resistance, which is usually the unaffiliated individual who's doing something as a hobby, because that they will be the least resistance point because they're, I mean, they may or may not be the people with the um big bucket of money to spend on lawyers, but often they are not. So I'm hoping that when it comes to the implementation part of the CRA and similar efforts and initiatives around the globe, that will go towards that reasonable route of let's look into who is turning something that was publicly available on the corner of the streets saying that you can take this for free, like who decided to actually put a label on it, put it in a package and sell it for money, because I think that's where the responsibility kicks in. Like I'm taking money for this, so I gotta be, held responsible for some things at least. And it will also be interesting to see how it will shift the open source landscape from the perspective of open source foundations, because at least in the CRA, there is currently a concept of stewardship. And that is kind of pointing towards having open source projects under the guidance and support of open source foundations.
I think as the CRA continues to loom and similar regulation with the US, it means that all companies are going to have to figure out how to do this kind of support and this kind of stabilization of a supply chain. And it makes much better sense to try to do that collectively than everybody doing it individually. But it's like a prisoner's dilemma. It's like nobody's moving. There is clearly enlightened self-interest to doing something collaboratively together in the upstream that makes your individual work much less arduous, but I don't see anything moving that direction yet. So what's it going to take? We've somewhat painted ourselves into a corner with regard to understanding all of the code in your given application because of how open source relies on open source that relies on open source, and the dependency tree that happens when you pull in one component and somehow your project now grows tenfold because it brought in all of these additional dependencies. And now we're telling companies, okay, well, you used that component that brought in those 1,000 dependencies, so you need to understand and be able to support those 1,000 dependencies as well. Is there a community behind everyone? I don't know. You're going to go find out. And if there isn't, are you going to go learn the code? I mean, there's the problem, the method of building software upon other software and the concept of reuse as much as possible is all excellent, right up until the point when we don't trust any of it. And be it for support, be it for malware, whatever the reason, we now have to do some level of unwinding, right, as to what our expectations are with how we've used this software before, and we have to make provisions to, as a commercial entity, if we're going to ship something that contains this open source, we have confidence that we know what's in there and we know how to support it. And it could be going to a community. That's a totally fine answer when there's actually a community to go to, and there's some level of recognition and influence and responsiveness of that community for you. And that also needs to be tested, right? But all of these things haven't existed in the past. And there are many, many product companies that are shipping, everything right down to a Linux operating system where they don't really know how Linux works. They don't really have any experts on the Linux operating system. Or if they do, it might be a driver that enabled their hardware. And that's the only thing that they really understand about the Linux kernel. So these are all gaps, right, that need to be filled. And it's going to be interesting times.
Yeah, I think it might call for kind of a little bit of a reimagining of this whole, not just open source, but also commercial ecosystem that's around it.
Yeah.
Because I do see your point in terms of I just wanted to use this one open source project or component or little library. Like, why is it my problem that it depends on 169 other ones that also depend on 30 to 200 other ones? Like,
Yep.
why all those dependencies are my problem from that day? And like, do I really need to maintain them all? Because that is also not sustainable if you have to do that yourself as a company. Or like, do I have to re-implement it all? Is that where we want to go? So it is no one size fits all, and it's not.
They aren't easy answers. No.
So what are you looking forward to in season 2?
What am I looking forward to? Just more conversations. I mean, I love the diverse input that we get. I love hearing different people's stories. As you just mentioned, you learn a lot, right? Being able to talk to different people who have been in this industry for a while, or brand new, and seeing what their experiences are. Right? We saw both in season 1. In season 2, I'm looking forward just to more of those kind of conversations because I'm very much enjoying learning from others.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And our first episode in this season will be with Claire Dillon, and we will talk about inner source with her, which I think was a really, really great conversation because it shows very well like how the methodologies of collaborative software development are applicable even just within the walls of one company or organization, and how it can help moving things forward faster and easier within that organization once you try to apply some more collaborative methods that isn't just for one small team, but like how multiple teams are working together, or how a big department or multiple departments are working together. Um, I really, really enjoyed that conversation, and I also really like how we have a diverse set of guests on the podcast in this season again, and it's really diverse in every sense of the word. So a lot of viewpoints, people who are writing software, people who are focusing on the business side of open source. And I think we already mentioned that we will be talking about licenses, which kind of connects all these bits and pieces together. And I think that season 2 will be really, really amazing. And I truly hope that all of you will really enjoy it. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and give us a lot of feedback, because we would love to hear, on one hand, what is your experience? And on the other hand, what content you find valuable? What are the topics that are most critical and crucial to you and your individual success or your business and corporate success? We want to hear about it all. And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. We want to hear from you. Please leave comments under the episodes that you watched. Share your feedback and share your experiences to continue the conversation. And let us know what topics you would like to hear next. We already have a lot of great content lined up for season 2. We will talk about inner source, or in other words, why and how companies are using open source methodologies internally. We will talk about why and how governments are using open source and touch on upcoming legislations such as the Cyber Resiliency Act in Europe. We will also discuss how to create open source projects and communities that last for decades. Stay tuned, because the next episode is just around the corner.
Wouldn't you wish there was a silver budget and bullet, but no, silver budget as well. Silver budget that is
that's
a silver
what you
bullet.
need, is a silver. Exactly.
That's it. And to be fair, some people.
So I bought some bidets. This should have been a very simple project. This should be simple. What bidet do you want? You install the bidet and you sit down and you enjoy the bidet. That's it, simple. But I bought the best bidet. And you know how engineers go. Nothing simple.
But we just had a good time just talking and whatnot. And by the end of it, he figured out I played pretty quick. So by the end of it, he actually made me play with him. And so I played music with Kix Brooks. That was fun.
Way cool. That's a great story.
He is waiting for me to finish this podcast so that, I don't know if you